Alright everybody, you probably know it, and I certainly do know it. Today is basically a point in time where we are in fact hoping to wrap up things regarding 2024. We're wrapping up another year in this whole decade of which that has been dubbed the slobbering 20s. I can partially put the blame on a majority of my own crew members, fellow members of Kaiju Force Neo included. But apart from what we've referred to the decade as, or what it's officially going to be known as by the rest of the public, things will certainly not be further from the truth regarding the many highs, lows, and other unique ways of summarizing such a big year that we've had. And I will say, there's been tons of events that have come around. Lots to recollect. So without further ado, I bring to you yet another piece regarding the end of a certain year. But I feel like that one big thing we ought to touch up on first is the fact that, of course, the holidays are upon us. And when that happens, we're bound to have lots of traffic. And with the fact that the new year is going to be upon us in a few more days, we're probably going to, in fact, be circumnavigating through many different obstacles in life. That's one way to put it. But one way to summarize this year is to pretty much, let's say, imagine Two-Face if it basically were a 365-day-long period of time, and Two-Face was randomly deciding whether to do good or evil for us. It was pretty much random even by my own standards, but I'd say having Batman's Two-Face here probably seems like a rather appropriate way to put this into context. Since after all, there's highs and lows. Granted, this is what we've had in every other year possible. There were highs and lows. Some years were pretty much so low that you could never possibly get up. And there were some years that happened to be very high that's what could possibly bring him down. Even in the slobbering 20s, I've actually managed to find a sustainable level of years that actually happened to do so well. Like, if I wanted to put this into perspective, then well, one way I can do this is if we basically ranked them from 1 through 5. Well, 2023 is obviously 1. So, the reason for that, it was a fantastic year. Nothing to it. 22 also was an amazing year for many different reasons of many different sorts. Then I would say maybe 2020 would have to follow up in that part. We had a lot of trips, we had a lot of things to look forward to, I had a lot of things to talk about and a lot of things worth sharing and plenty of content that came around. But we obviously know that that thing goes all the way up in 5 regarding the absolute worst thing we'd ever possibly had. There's simply no doubt about it. Why Time Magazine lied about 2020 is beyond me. And how nobody just gets it. I mean, it's like that school bus driver who just didn't understand the federal law requiring her to stop at a railroad crossing. And that was 24 years ago, believe it or not. So 2024 could probably go in number 4. Yeah, not even as good as 2020. And let me tell you why. There's a few different possible reasons that we can never possibly put 2024 in any much of a higher spot. Alright? It's a bad year. Yeah, I've said it. A bad year. And it's the first time in a while that in this whole decade we've actually had a bad year. No doubt about it. And this is certainly knowing the fact that there's plenty of cons out there worth sharing. I mean, oh man, I will certainly have lots to say on that department. But you know what? Let's go ahead and talk a bit about the pros, shall we? Spend about 10 minutes or so in that field. So, First of all, the year itself did start on a somewhat high note. Lots of different games I played, lots of different things that were on the PS4 that I put together because I obviously didn't have a PS5 yet, but more on that later. In February and March, we basically had a lot of different things take place. I mean, I've had plenty of company around, I've had plenty of people come over to this place and even rent the place for some time, which was a good thing for me to at least be able to have even a close end to afford this place. After all, there's been plenty of close calls I've had this whole year. And thankfully with peak season regarding many work forms that I've had to do with myself lately, lots of jobs I had to do work with in this whole year, I was more than able to financially support myself in even the biggest of circumstances that we've had to deal with. But this certainly is not anything to do with what else came abroad. Obviously in February and March, you might recall that that was a point where I made my last visit to the ECU. And much like the PS5, that'll also be an appropriate thing to talk about later. In March, I did a lot of revisitation because 2024 is what I considered the most recent revisitation lapse, a period of which that I tend to regard a lot of nostalgia. I spent the entire summer, in fact, doing just that. But even before then, in March and April especially, when it got a lot warmer over time, I was actually going on ahead and revisiting certain things in life. Things that I hadn't done in a long time. In fact, there's tons of photos that I have taken. And as you probably have already noticed by this point, there were basically things regarding new movies that I have seen, as the very last movie of 2023 was Migration. And I'd say that was a unique way to end the year, but it wasn't really a great Illumination film, albeit because Illumination has seen a lot of success with other entries. And like the PS5 and the ECU, we got Illumination Pictures as a subject for 2024. So more on that later though. And March, of course, we had plenty of big time blockbusters out there, as well as some games. Some movies, of course, would include Kung Fu Panda 4, Ghostbusters, The Frozen Empire, as well as Godzilla and Kong, The New Empire. So you could say March 2024 was a pretty big time, and mostly so because of the fact that at the time it was spring break. So a good majority of kids were wanting to go to the movies for some time. And I feel like that, with all those movies released, it was a pretty wild way to do things. But then, of course, by the end of the third week, a little thing that I had gotten nearly 2 months prior ended up progressing so bad that I had to go to the emergency room. Yeah. Basically, this is where we come to the first major con that I have to talk about here. On the night of March 20th, 2024, yeah, shortly after midnight, I ended up waking up extremely high in body temperature, super tachycardia, and I was also violently shaking. Yeah. When I was brought over to the emergency room, they thought it was a combination of fever, tachycardia, and possibly a panic attack. I later went on and figured out that I apparently had severe thyroiditis. Yeah. The inflammation of the thyroid gland right here. So, this is something that, believe it or not, is still of relevance today, 9 months later. But, thankfully, it's something that I was able to keep under control. And even treat it to the point where it no longer is a problem. So, you might think that that is a pretty simple thing that I've had to deal with, but no. The fact is that had I not been brought over to the emergency room, those symptoms are what is known as thyroid storm. And you probably know by now, that thyroid storm is actually a deadly condition. Extreme production of T4 hormones and release of T4 hormones, the kind of which that are affiliated with high energy, high heart rate, and metabolism. And if they're not under control, there's a high chance that metabolism will be so great that a number of things could happen. Heart rate will become too high to the point where it can evolve into different conditions, such as atrial fibrillation, as well as some blockages and other diseases, if untreated, of course. I ended up having to make another visit to the doctor's office after a mid-February 2024 assessment, which of course took place in an entirely different complex with the same physician that I've had for several years. Yeah, basically since the start of the decade, I've had a physician whom was a member of internal medicine and whom originally started work at the Columbia St. Mary's, which has since been bought out by Ascension. And nowadays, I was able to go to Madison Seton and Ascension, which is located all the way out in Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. So, that of course is a bit of a story overall. Mid-February 2024 was a point where we had major blood work done in order to assess for any sort of vitamin and mineral intakes. Basically, what my body composition has. Calcium, magnesium, sodium, and many other things. Of course, when I had to do my second meet-in though, after that little incident that night at the ER, well, he basically just had it dished out as a regular panic attack. So, pretty frustrating, if you ask me. Didn't even bother to go so far to figure out that this was in fact a thyroid disorder. I mean, I know what symptoms I had that night. I know that it wasn't a panic attack. I know that high heart rate and fever don't just happen automatically. I mean, I can't even get stressed or experience anxiety anymore due to years of training mentally and physically in order to have it completely voided. So, some of you might wonder how stress and anxiety can be completely immunized. Well, this unfortunately is something that I'm probably not even emotionally ready to discuss with the world just yet. In any case though, even when I did manage to get out of the doctor's office and ER with loads of medical bills that I had to pay up, which thankfully insurance was able to cover for a good majority of them, but still had to pay up for a little bit of the rest. In any case though, I was stuck with hyperthyroidism symptoms for over a month, especially after March 19th, which was when I first started experiencing these sort of symptoms. Well over a month, I will say. In that time though, I feel like I had managed to do a lot of different things. I mean, throughout the rest of March, I did in fact play a lot of games, most of which were pretty crappy, like Transformers Earthspark Expedition, Skull Island Rise of Kong, well, a good majority of many other pieces there, but a good majority of which were for the PS4. It was also that same month in March that I had also played certain brand new titles. One of the first that I played in 2024 that was brand new for 2024 was Persona 3 Reload. So, if you ask me, that was one heck of a game to start with. And in terms of, well, best 2024 games, well, I might as well just go over some of the rest. Some other nice picks will include LEGO Horizon Adventures, Astrobot, Monster Jam Showdown, and many others. I will say that some big titles out there like Dragon Ball Sparking Zero and Call of Duty Black Ops 6 have unfortunately slipped my mind. And out of my grasp too. I would have gone on ahead and ordered some copies of both of these games. But man, everybody is just high in demand. Like, they got sold out within just hours of time. How does that even work? I don't even know. But I guess it just goes to show that if you don't act fast enough, you just can't quite get a hold of them as fast as you want to. Anyways, though, back to the rest of the year as it stood out. In April, a lot of the hyperthyroidism stuff still stuck around. But thankfully, binaural therapy had allowed for me to eventually clear up the worst of it. And by the end of April, it thankfully was actually able to go away on its own. Yeah, no joke. The hyperthyroidism stuff basically exhausted itself, cleared itself out by the end of April and the beginning of May. So, in that time, of course, in April, there were a lot of revisitation lapses I did, as well as some things that I did with some friends and family, including a trip to Hartford's Wisconsin Auto Museum. You know, it's that little location where Nash, AMC, and Kissel Automotive basically lay to rest. There was even a steam locomotive. Yeah, Sioux Line 1003, but more on that later as well. There, of course, was also other things that I did, including a small visit to the Shady Lanes Greenhouse, which had itself a model train layout. I mean, Wisconsin Auto Museum had a similar thing going on with a 1949 Lionel train set up in the museum itself. And basically, the Shady Lane Greenhouse, I'd say, was a pretty unique follow-up. But when it comes down to all these different things about trains, that's actually a thing that I have very well managed to take up. In fact, 2024 alone might as well be a big, big year when it comes to rail fanning. I mean, if you haven't checked, please do. Kaiju Force Neo Rail Fanning Adventures, which I'll set up a link in the description box below so you guys can have easy access to it whenever you please. And I will say that rail fanning has certainly been at its best when it comes to the year of 2024 as a whole, and with plenty of other things that I feel like could be worth noting when it comes to the rail fanning stuff. But you know what though? If there's one thing about rail fanning in 2024 that I certainly have managed to touch up on, well, it was actually an early birthday gift that my old man, if you will, Nolan Dettori, did in fact set up for me a surprise trip to the Illinois Railway Museum. Yeah, we went down to Union in his ride, which was a Fiat 500X. And we basically just made our way down there and spent about 6 hours, even catching a ride on the Chicago Northwestern 411, which of course is this. And if that's not enough, well, there were plenty of other inclusions at the IRM that were going on at the time, as it was mostly Chicago Northwestern weekend, but they also had other equipment up and running as well. So, not very much for what it was. There was even the trolley, but of course, we certainly can't forget about the many other things that took place as well. The many exhibits they had, steam locomotives, coaches, and tons of different things out there. Even having itself a nice little souvenir shop and model train layout set up inside one of their stores. So, plenty of things worth discussing in that part. Of course, there were actually other things that we did when it came to railroad museums that I have visited as well. Trains have in fact become more than just a big hobby of mine. And while it has been something I haven't really done a whole lot of, it's mostly because all the money that I have put to were mostly made for Nerf and Hot Wheels related content. NSR, HWH, that's mostly what it is. And well, in June 2024 came probably one of the biggest milestones I feel like I might have ever reached. The age of 25. Yeah. This was not just any birthday that I could have ever possibly had in my life. It was an event. An event of a lifetime. And obviously I mentioned that the IRM in Union, Illinois was morally just a early birthday gift that Nolan decided to give to me. But of course, we certainly can't forget that he also managed to give me a few other gifts. And on top of all that, I feel like that my birthday itself was not only well celebrated with all the different gifts and all the different confectionaries that people have handed over to me, friends, family, and whatnot, but this certainly was a nice way to conclusify such an incredible event. Obviously, when it comes to movies, even after March 2024, there were still plenty of others that I feel like I could highlight at this point. There was Monkey Man, Civil War, The Fall Guy, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, If, and even throughout the summer and onwards, especially when it comes to the fact that I have started a second season of films I'm willing to talk about again, with plenty of films that I have managed to talk about again, including the Jurassic Park series, Napoleon, and many, many others. So, I was more than glad that I had created a second season of films I'm willing to talk about again, and having it become a big core contextual series for the year of 2024. Basically, between May and November 2024, films I'm willing to talk about again sure did take a while, for 68 episodes plus several bonus episodes, which catered to different new films that came out at the time. And if you're wondering, yes, there will in fact be many more new film inclusions when it comes to the Talk About It universe, as I refer to it. A collaborative collection, which comprises of different series that I've made over the years, like films I should have talked about years ago being one of them, along with TV shows that deserve the spotlight and films I'm willing to talk about again. But I'm sure that next year in 2025, I actually will in fact create an entirely new series. Kind of like what I did in 2023 when I did TV shows that deserve the spotlight. In 2025, I'll have yet another new series up and running. Very likely by the end of February. But until that happens, it's good for me to take a break from a lot of that stuff. And with all the seasonal stuff going on and all the holidays and all the large amounts of snow that are on the ground, I'd say my schedule is more than covered for a while. So, obviously the thyroiditis was more or less just something that I was thankfully able to clear up on my own. And, well, guess what? That same month in June, it did show up again. But it was mostly with the tachycardia stuff. And I will say that while thyroiditis is mostly there as a means of inflammation, causing the gland to swell and also increase heart rate, I feel like that it was just more than that, Obviously, it's known to occasionally sprout hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism symptoms. Obviously, the hyper part got well and out of the way between March 19th and May 1st, 2024. But similar things started occurring by June 12th, 2024, a full month later, a little more. So, I was actually able to do more research, and I actually did come across a series of techniques by various Indian doctors known as Ayurveda. And Ayurveda is known for creating dietary and lifestyle changes to specifically target various problems and be rid of them forever. In my case, being the thyroid gland causing problems, well, all I had to do was follow some steps and do some various yoga and meditation, and also include a lot of different dietary pieces. Some snacks and some foods, like raw onions and coconut, were in fact a big part of it. And then of course with certain vegetables and fruits, as well as the inclusion of iodine-based goods, like carrots and milk, I was more than able to eventually allow for things to clear up for good by the start of October 2024. And by then, there was a lot of content I managed to do, including a second season of Nerf Secrets Revealed Aftershock, a series that was more or less catered to the likes of me testing out various Nerf blasters with a known mod known as the Invisibullet. And by this very point, I will say that in spite of some of the more challenging bits that we've had to offer through this whole year, including peak season and including many new blockbusters that we have gotten, like Wicked, Sonic 3, and even the prequel to The Lion King known as Mufasa, I will say, regarding pop culture, like video games and movies, we've definitely been hit pretty hard. Having quit social media, especially pre-2024, was more than a motivator for me to eventually take up new things, to occupy my own time. And being that yoga and meditation was one of them, binaural beat therapy sessions was another one of them, and of course, putting more money into books instead of social media shares, stocks, as well as in-app purchases. I feel like that I have managed to spend my money a lot more wisely in that regard, and if you can't already tell, being stressed and anxiety free all day and all night long can mostly be explained from the facts at hand that social media just was never good for me in the first place. And in terms of all the pros and cons, well, obviously the pros will include a good majority of the different games and books and films that I've had to talk about, whether old or new. And in terms of new games and films, a good majority of them were just amazing. Some of the best that I might have ever had to do with. So 24 has definitely got us covered when it comes to modern pop culture. They really know how to hammer it up when it comes to that stuff. Much like 23 and 22, 24 certainly did an outstanding job regarding pop culture, entertaining me very thoroughly with the likes of films and games, as well as some other things. Then of course we have all the different trips, the revisitation laps of 2024, which did in fact encompass many different things. We had my visits to Hartford, my visits to the Shady Lane Greenhouse, we had my visits to a few other locations, and of course a more recent trip to Iowa. Something that seems to be coming through every year now. As of 2022, it seems that it happens on an annual basis, especially in the fall for some reason. And with all that in mind, that does give 2024 a lot of points. If it were just for the pros alone, I would probably have to go all the way to a good 8.7 out of 10.1 regarding 2024 as a whole. Except for the fact that cons are indeed present here. Thyroiditis was something that had carried over throughout almost the entire year. And while it actually was unbelievably bad at first, nearly lethal actually, I really did almost feel like I was gonna die that very time. And just think about it, March 20th, what else does that convey at some point in this decade? Well, maybe not something we need to be talking about. But that obviously was a pretty bad thing that happened in my life. There were tons of medical bills that I thankfully was covered, as I'd said, by my insurance. But I still did have to pay off some of those things. So I guess you could say it was a bit of a waste of money that just happened in life. It is what it is, as I was told. But then of course come along other things. And I will say that August, September, and October seem to always have the biggest fortunes of every year. While March and February, mostly February and March, might not have as much. And that just seems to be the thing regardless of what year it is. And there's probably other things that I could talk about regarding why those exact periods of each year happen to be the best or the worst of each year, but that's an entirely different story. Other cons, of course, will include some of the various other things, like what we've been advertised about many times over, Gaza, Israel conflict, and then, of course, there were the many conservation efforts that were going on, the many different problems relating to social media, control and ownership, propaganda spreading, advertising of political stuff, and we know, obviously, every 4 years there's a political campaign for the president. And this one here, I hope, doesn't spiral out of control like it has done a few other times since the start of the new millennium. I really do hope that it doesn't progress to a point where it all of a sudden becomes one of the worst pieces of civil unrest in history. You know? Because what happened nearly 4 years ago, well, A little thing in Washington, D.C., even worse than 9/11. Nothing could be further from the truth on that part. And with various other things here and there that had come around from financial things that went on about, I got defrauded on my credit account. And then, of course, probably one of the worst things that had happened to me personally, apart from the thyroiditis and the ER visit that I had to make as a result of thyroid storm, would have to be the loss of KFN U125 Duncan. A 2011 Nissan Juke with a DIG Nissan Class V6 engine. The same type of engine that was especially a carryover from the newer GTR models. So just think about it. A Juke running on a GTR motor? Who would have thought? That'd be like if we basically had, let's say, a Ford Fusion run on a Mustang engine. Or maybe the Chevrolet Trax running on a Camaro engine. Especially when it comes to the SS or Z78, if you know what I mean. But Duncan was definitely a rare species when it came to many different things. But you know what? I'm more than glad that I was actually compensated for this by my own insurance company. I mean, in the same way that insurance was able to cover the costs of various extreme medical bills that I've had to pay throughout the whole year, my car insurance was also able to grant me a $10,000 total loss check that was more than enough to cover for the total loss that was Duncan himself. And the cause of this? Well, a cheaply built timing chain, which I hadn't paid attention to the point where it eventually snapped, and I was out there in total darkness in the middle of nowhere for 2 whole hours. It was quiet out there, and I had no idea what to do. So I basically just used satellite technology in order to phone ahead to a tow truck company to get me out of there. Obviously, with a lot of different work I've had to do, there were some ups and downs in that part as well. Such as we know, I've talked a lot about FedEx being a primary source of my own income, which that is still going insanely well. In fact, I'd say it's gone so well throughout 2024 that even in spite of the many problems I've had to deal with this whole time, I'd say we definitely have managed to work things pretty well. Yet some things just aren't always so simple to work with. Yeah, and I will say that having some good relationships with my own coworkers and my own teammates regarding the facility that I work in general, that does in fact also play out pretty well. Because after all, good communication, teamwork, organization, and pre-planning do make for an eventful day each time we do our work. And with all the other things I've had to do, inventory liquidation when it comes to selling on eBay, as I have mentioned that before many different times, and other work sources like private contracting and whatnot, they're all playing out pretty well in terms of creating my income every month. And this house still is rather cheap for me to live in, despite the many things that are going on in the economy. But that's not something I do care about at all. No. I just do my work and I pay the bills. That's it. I have no reason to complain about something that I have no control over of. So, when it comes to my overall final scoring of this year, 8.7 out of 10.1 would have been from all the pros here. But I'd say with the cons that I've had to mention and whatnot, it probably brings it down to maybe 3 points. How about? Because some of the personal things especially were a problem. So, having lost a car and having almost lost my own life really is quite a way to go through an entire year. Pretty much living out the rest of my life without big things in life. But then again, there comes the revelation. A near-death experience in 2 different cases. Even though the loss of my own car wasn't necessarily because I got in an accident or whatnot. It was just a defective part in the engine that snapped, causing the entire engine to become a total loss from the inside out. The car was no longer operable, and the cost of the engine to replace it, as the timing chain was a critical part, would have technically outweighed the benefits. So having the engine replaced was not a viable option, even for me. Even though I was technically refunded with the compensation money that I got from my insurance company, I still went on ahead and purchased another set of wheels. And I can thank Russ Darrow for accommodating such a big choice that I've had to make. So, in due time, I will thankfully be rid of one big chapter in life, having closed the book on another ride that I've had for some time. I mean, there's just been a lot of moments I've shared with that car in particular. It might as well have been like Herbie from the Love Bug films, or even like Christine, but in a more powerful sort of aura. So 3 points basically done to around 5.7 out of 10.1. I would overall consider 2024 to be a bad year, but because with a lot of different pros that thankfully kept me worthwhile and kept things as good as I could have possibly gotten it to, and plenty of different things I managed to do with my life in order to spend time away from social media, hopefully for the rest of my life, I will gladly say that 2024 was at least a win in only a few ways. So while it unfortunately does not come around to the levels of 2020, 2022, or 2023, it at least does better than a lot of other years. Through all the years that I've had to live with, I'd say it's probably about average. 5.7 out of 10.1 might not be that big of a score, but at least it's much better than most others that I've had to live with. So, end of story. But all in all, that's pretty much a lot I had to say about this year. But don't get me wrong, what could we give for 2025, 2026, 2027, or anything like that? I guess only time will tell. So we are bound to, in fact, embark on a whole new chapter of our life with a lot of new events that are going to kick off in the year 2025. And so, I bid you farewell once again. But keep in mind, I will come back another time near the end of 2025 in order to give out a similar report. But first, who knows what's going to happen in 2025? We could have something develop in the country or even the world. We could have bigger things that we've had to deal with throughout the whole decade progress to even higher levels. We could have something entirely different. But only time will tell. Only time will tell. So a good 5.7 out of 10.1 for 2024 is what we got here. We'll just have to see what 2025 has to offer, and then I'll evaluate it from there.